Between April 19th and May 25th, 1912, as the world grieved over the loss of the RMS Titanic, the United States Senate recorded an official inquiry on over 1,100 pages. These pages covered 18 days, 86 witnesses, and other affidavits, exhibits, and statements, but not all witnesses were of the same interest to the Senate subcommittee. While these numbers suggest an average of 12 pages per witness, the Senate naturally spent more time questioning White Star Line officials and ship's officers than they might a third-class passenger. In episodes 2 and 3, we heard from White Star Line Managing Director Bruce Ismay, whose U.S. testimony spans 56 long pages. But believe it or not, he's not the most questioned witness from the U.S. inquiry. Far from it. Third Officer Pittman was questioned for 59 pages. Guglielmo Marconi, who invented the wireless telegraph used aboard Titanic, was questioned for 61 pages, as was the Carpathia's wireless operator Harold Cottam. Philip Franklin, Vice President of the International Mercantile Marine, comes in at 65 pages, and Fourth Officer Boxhall contributed 66 pages of testimony. Today on Witness Titanic, we hear from the man who tops the list, and for good reason. No witness to the sinking would have more official info to offer than the highest-ranking surviving officer. Of course, I'm talking about Second Officer Charles Herbert Lightoller. Today, we dive into his 81 pages of testimony. My name is James Penca, and as chairman of this inquiry, I welcome you to Episode 5 of our endeavor to better understand Titanic. Officer Lightoller is going to help us greatly in this journey, as the man has a very clear and concise memory of the event. He seems to stay very calm throughout the sinking. He's one of the first to ever board Titanic, and unlike Ismay, he never really leaves Titanic. He is one of the very few to survive the sinking after ending up in the freezing Atlantic waters. So he has a lot to tell us. Though he is an employee of the White Star Line, and as the highest-ranking surviving officer, he has plenty of reason to alter his memories a little bit, so we must proceed with caution. Like I did with Ismay, I went through all 81 pages of Lightoller's testimony, and I pulled out no less than 128 interesting quotes. Don't worry, they will not all end up in this episode, otherwise this will be a 4-parter, but I hope that the quotes that we do hear today and next week will give us a good look at what he witnessed, and as always, bring us closer to Titanic herself. I will now call Mr. Charles Herbert Lightoller to come forward and take the stand. All right, let's get to know Mr. Lightoller a little bit. First thing to know, his nickname is Lights, and that is a definite candidate for coolest nickname a person could possibly have. So Lights, like every witness, is asked first for some basic info from the senators. He is, of course, Charles Herbert Lightoller. He resides in Netley Abbey, Hampshire, which is just a little ways outside of Southampton. In fact, as Lightoller's ships departed Southampton, which pretty much every ship he would be on would leave out of Southampton, it would pass his hometown on its way to more open waters. So potentially his wife could have run down to the coast to wave to Charles as he sailed by. This is a scenario that I completely made up, and who knows if this ever happened. But my father worked on the railroad for 45 years, and my family used to run down to the crossing to see his freight train fly by at crazy speeds. He would lean over the railing to wave. It was exhilarating and terribly dangerous, but it was the best. So perhaps, if not Lightoller, I'm sure somebody on the crew, somebody's family in Netley Abbey would have run down to the coast to wave to Dad as he went by. Lightoller also says he is 38, that he is employed as a seaman, and that he has been a seaman for 13 years and 3 months. When asked what capacities he has served, he says, and I quote, "In all the capacities in the White Star service, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and 1st officer. You'll notice that he says he's been promoted within the White Star Line all the way up to 1st officer. So why then is he known to history as 2nd Officer Lightoller? Was he demoted before boarding Titanic? Well, it's actually quite easy to understand. See, he actually wasn't the first second officer. He was actually the first officer and the second officer. The second first officer was actually the first chief, and the first second ended up not being an officer at all. Does that make sense? It doesn't make any sense? Okay, we'll come back to that later. All you need to know for now is that Charles Lightoller is a senior officer. The chief, first, and second officers are all senior officers directly under Captain Smith. 3rd through 6th officers are the junior officers. We'll get to the numbers later. He is asked what were the hours of his watch, his shift, if you will. He answers, 6 o'clock until 10 o'clock, sir, and clarifies that this is both at night and in the morning. The hours of each officer's watch is pretty important to know off the top of your head if you don't want to get lost during witness testimony. So let's take a quick second to see when every senior officer was on duty to try to commit it to memory here. Chief Officer Henry Wilde would have been found on the bridge from 2 to 6 a.m. and p.m. So 2 to 6, that's tough. You're getting up at 2 in the morning and you're on watch until the sun comes up, basically. Then you can sleep, I assume, and then you're back on at 2 p.m. until 6 p.m. around dinner time. So that's tough. It's not too terrible. At 6, he would be relieved by our friend Second Officer Lightoller until 10. So Lightoller is 6 to 10, so that's at 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. That's not bad. That's sort of like a very early normal job. And then 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. I feel like that's much better than Wilde's hours. I much prefer Lightoller's. But lastly, First Officer William Murdoch would take over from 10 to 2. This is my favorite one, I think. This fits with my sleep schedule a bit. So you're 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. That's great. That's like a really chill job to just like come into work at 10 and then you're done by 2. And then you come back at 10 p.m. and you're kind of a late night kind of person, but it's fine. You don't have to get to work till 10 the next day. So I like 10 to 2 the best. So sign me up for first officer. But you'll notice that all 3 senior officers are 4 hours on, 8 hours off. This is quite the comfortable schedule compared to all the junior officers, which we will get to in a minute. For those paying attention, by the way, this schedule puts First Officer Murdoch as the senior officer on watch at the time of the iceberg collision, though I think a lot of you knew that already. Now, as I mentioned, Lightoller's testimony is very valuable. He was around for a lot of important milestones in Titanic's short career, the first of which was the sea trials Titanic undertook before the maiden voyage. For our new Titanic friends, every ship that was built for commercial service or otherwise in 1912, and every ship today for that matter, must undergo sea trials to ensure that they are seaworthy, to make sure they were built correctly. A government representative must attend the trials and approve the ship before any passengers can board. Now, Titanic was only put through 1 day of sea trials, while her older sister ship, Olympic, had 2. Now, the belief is Titanic wasn't put through as rigorous a trial because Olympic had already passed her trials and Titanic was a near copy. So on April 2nd, just 8 days before the maiden voyage, Titanic's trials were conducted. And yes, this is an abnormally tight schedule. Ships usually have more time between their trials and their maiden voyage for things like promotional days where the public of Southampton can come tour the ship for a little ticket. And I think they usually donated the tickets, the money made to like the local hospital or something. So they usually did fun things like that. But due to multiple construction delays, issues with Olympic coming back to Belfast and needing to be repaired, the voyage of Titanic just kept getting delayed, so Titanic is quite behind here. Our last 1912 witness, Bruce Ismay, was not on board for the sea trials, so we didn't hear much from him about them. And unfortunately, the majority of those who did witness the sea trials and the sinking did not survive the sinking. So Lightoller is one of the few who can give us a detailed account of it. So let's see what he remembers of them. He is asked, of what did these sea trials consist? And he answers rather bluntly, turning circles and adjusting compasses. I love this response. I don't know if I'm reading into it too much and giving Lightoller more sass than he intended, but to me, he sounds like he hates sea trials or hates that he has to explain them to these senators who know nothing about ships. But they need to ask these questions, so they continue. They ask what turning circles consists of. They need him to elaborate more than just saying turning circles and adjusting compasses. And he says, seeing in what space the ship will turn under certain helms and with the engines at various speeds. These circles are actually quite critical, despite how Lightoller is sort of minimizing them. Ships today have a big plaque on their bridge, usually with detailed diagrams of how long it will take the ship to stop, how long it will take to turn a full circle, how wide that circle will be, that sort of thing. So that way a captain can know what the ship's capabilities are. No matter who's on the bridge, they all know what their ship will do in certain movements. So a lot of this part of building a new ship remains the same to this day. Sea trials are very important. Now, throughout his testimony on this, Lightoller describes the sea trials in a kind of a random order, so I've lined them all up here for your listening enjoyment. He is asked, how much time was spent in the test? About 5 hours. During that time, those circles were made? Yes, sir. And the ship reversed? Yes, sir. What was the next thing that was done with the ship? She was run a certain distance on a comparatively straight course and back again. How long did it take you? Approximately 4 hours. And after about 7 hours, the tests were concluded? With the exception of the full speed astern, that is to see in what distance the ship will stop with the engine's full speed astern, what we call the full speed astern test. That was only a matter of minutes. He is next asked who was on board for the sea trials. Keep an ear out in this answer for something that may not sound quite right to you. He remembers the following men being on board for the trials. Captain Smith, Mr. Murdoch, Chief Officer, myself, First Officer, Mr. Blair, Second Officer, Mr. Pittman, Third Officer, Mr. Boxhall, Fourth Officer, Mr. Lowe, Fifth Officer, Mr. Moody, Sixth Officer, and Mr. Andrews of Harlan and Wolff. Mr. Bell, Chief Engineer, Mr. Ferguson, Second Engineer, Mr. Hesketh, also Second. That is all I know. Okay, you're confused. Why does he name himself, again, as First Officer, and who is Officer Blair? Well, he is actually listing the officers as were originally assigned to Titanic. See, after these trials, but before the maiden voyage, Henry Wilde, Captain Smith's chief officer on Olympic, was brought in last minute to serve as chief officer on Titanic. Much to his dismay, apparently. He was not thrilled to be joining Titanic last minute. But this bumped Murdoch down to first officer, Lightoller bumped down to second, and the original second officer, David Blair, was bumped off the staff altogether. Now, why does he not just bump down to third officer? Well, this would make him a junior officer, remember. This would be a big pay cut, very different responsibilities, and much worse work hours. So I actually don't know off the top of my head, I don't know if I've ever read, if he was given the option to stay on and bump down to a junior officer and he just couldn't take the demotion, or if it was just accepted that should a new officer be brought in, the lowest senior officer would disembark altogether and serve on another vessel. I assume it's the latter. Regardless, Blair does suddenly lose his position on this ship, and he even writes a letter home saying how disappointed he is to be missing this incredible maiden voyage ahead. Unbeknownst to him, of course, this demotion would probably save his life. So now you should have your senior officers straight. Under Captain Smith is Chief Officer Wilde, First Officer Murdoch, and Second Officer Lightoller. These are the most important men aboard Titanic as far as navigation is concerned. One last comment from Lightoller of his time in Belfast sheds some light on a common Titanic misunderstanding. You may have heard that the crew of Titanic never conducted a boat drill. Oh my gosh, how could they? How awful. They had it coming. Not so fast. No, the passengers never had to go through a boat drill, and that is unfortunate. But Lightoller does mention a lifeboat test that is conducted by the crew in Belfast. He is asked, was a test of the lifeboats made before you sailed for Southampton?
All the gear was tested.
Were the lifeboats lowered?
Yes, sir. All the boats on the ship were swung out, and those that I required were lowered down as far as I wanted them, some all the way down, and some dropped into the water.
Following all of these trials and tests, Titanic does depart Belfast and heads for Southampton. And once in Southampton, we can let Lightoller dispel another Titanic misconception. All we ever see in Titanic media is overconfident men ignoring warning signs and cutting corners. It makes the sinking more dramatic and fun for the viewers because, oh, they deserved it. These were bad people. It's not as much fun if everybody's innocent. We need some bad people so we don't feel so bad about this disaster. Well, of course, it's not so black and white. Lightoller goes into incredible detail about a Captain Clark, who was a representative of the British Board of Trade who had to board Titanic once she arrived in Southampton and approve of her safety features before she could go to sea. And Lightoller describes him as someone not ready in any way to accept that ships could be unsinkable. He is asked, who was this officer of the British Board of Trade?
Captain Clark. We call him a nuisance because he is so strict, because he makes us fork out every detail. He would insist upon them all being absolutely brought out on deck every time, everything that contributes to the ship's equipment. Life preservers throughout the ship, all the boats turned out, uncovered, all the tanks examined, all the breakers examined, oars counted, boats turned out, rudders tried, all the davits tried. There was innumerable detail work. The boats lowered, put in the water, and pulled out and brought back again, and if he was not satisfied, sent back again.
So as Titanic heads across the Atlantic, at least according to Lightoller and Captain Clark, she was well equipped and well tested should an incident occur. And according to our last 1912 witness, Bruce Ismay, she had more than enough lifeboats to fulfill the requirements of the law and more than enough watertight compartments to minimize any damage she was likely to endure. So all should be right with the world. Lightoller's testimony now skips to Sunday, April 14th, the day of the iceberg collision. Now, as a reminder, Lightoller would have been on duty on the bridge from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. and then again from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., with the collision happening almost 2 hours after Murdoch takes over. So what are Lightoller's first memories of this tragic Sunday? I give you a few quotes.
I remember the commander coming out to me sometime that day and showing me a telegram, and this had reference to the position of ice.
Giving what?
An approximate position, and presumably the maximum eastern longitude.
A warning to you of its proximity?
Giving the position. No warning, but giving the position. A mere bald statement of fact.
Did you regard it as a warning when you got that information?
We get those repeatedly. And various other things, and we regard them as information.
What did you do about it?
Worked approximately the time we should be up to this position.
What did you find?
Somewhere around 11 o'clock.
Did you report that fact to anyone?
I did.
To whom?
The first officer. I just mentioned, as I had done previously, we will be up around the ice somewhere about 11 o'clock, I suppose.
So this testimony that I just read, which is actually a compilation of 3 separate parts of his testimony, are really fascinating to read because Lightoller is fully aware of ice ahead, and he even knows the exact time they expect to be reaching the ice at about 11 p.m. But I love how he insists that the telegram is not a warning. It is just a statement of fact. It is information. So I guess according to Lightoller, Titanic never received an iceberg warning. They just received information, and I think that's pretty wild. He also shuts down the senators again later when they inquire further about this. Senator Smith says, "The officer in charge, Mr. Murdoch, was fully advised by you that you were in the proximity of these bergs." And Lightoller replies,
"I would hardly call that proximity."
That is brilliant. Lightoller is either showcasing the mentality of the time period or downplaying their negligence. Personally, it's probably a bit of both. He's using the mentality of the time period to downplay their negligence, but either way, terribly interesting testimony. Now we jump to 6 p.m. on April 14th. Lightoller begins his last watch aboard Titanic, the last incident-free watch of Titanic's career. He is asked, what was the complement of your ship that night? And this is a great question because we know the 3 senior officers, but what about the men serving under them at any given time? He answers,
myself and 2 juniors.
Where were those 2 juniors stationed?
They have various duties to perform, taking the various parts of the ship, sometimes in the wheelhouse. At different periods, one has to go the whole rounds of the ship and see that everything is in order.
So we talked about the senior officers' watch hours. So what about these junior officers? This requires a bit of an explanation. First of all, very basics. You know how there's first, second, and third class? There's 3 classes of passengers. There are also 3 groups of crew. They're not in any order of importance or anything, but there are 3 departments aboard Titanic. There's the deck department, the victualling department, and the engineering department. The engineering department would be, of course, the engineers who work in the engine room, but also the stokers in the boiler rooms and whatnot. So basically anybody who helps make the ship move. Then there's the deck department who are in charge of navigation. They're the men on deck, literally scrubbing the deck, like they're the traditional sailors, I guess you could say. And then the victualling department would be like customer-facing staff, stewards, waiters, and whatnot. So those are the 3 departments, but in today's episode, we only need to talk about the deck department because that's where we are. That's where Lightoller is from. So the majority of the ship's deck department are split into 2 watches, and they're referred to as the starboard and port watches. Those are just names to help differentiate the 2 halves. And the junior officers are also split into those watches as well. So 3rd Officer Pittman and 5th Officer Lowe are on the port watch, while the starboard watch junior officers are 4th Officer Boxhall and 6th Officer Moody. These men and all the quartermasters, able-bodied seamen, etc., work on a schedule of 4 hours on and 4 hours off. I want you to think about that for a moment. Can you imagine for one entire week never getting more than 4 hours of continuous sleep? Luckily, you do not have to. The author of the incredible book, Guide to the Crew of Titanic, Günter Babler, tried to keep to this schedule for 1 week, just for his own knowledge. And needless to say, it did not go well. It is not an easy daily existence to keep to. In fact, 5th Officer Lowe will mention in his testimony that they don't get much sleep, so when they sleep very deeply, or as he puts it, when we sleep, we die. So this is what I mean when I say the junior officers, it's a big difference. To only have 4 hours of sleep at any given time, I could absolutely never do this. But the senior officers, they get 8 hours off. So, my gosh, much better. But because of this, because it's staggered in that way, the senior officers don't have 2 junior officers who are always on with them. So on this April 14th, on Lightoller's final watch, he begins at 6 p.m. He would have had Pittman and Lowe for 2 hours, and then the starboard watch would take over, led by Boxhall and Moody. I hope that wasn't terribly boring, but I find the inner workings of the crew and their work hours fascinating. For example, did you know that there were night watchmen on Titanic who made sure, I don't know, the dining room was empty when it needed to be empty? I didn't know that until I read Gunter's book, so read that book. It's fascinating. Now let's ask Lightoller, knowing that ice was technically ahead, I guess he didn't get any warnings, but he knows that the ice is there. Was there anything he and his junior officers could have done to avoid the berg during his watch? Luckily for us, he has asked 3 questions that will give us some insight into whether he thought there was anything he could have done. The first question: have you ever known a ship to change her route by reason of the presence of icebergs?
No, sir. We receive our orders. The routes are laid down. As a matter of fact, these routes are laid down by some of your naval men in the United States, and we adhere to them. We have an ice route when ice is very prevalent, and we know that a lot of ice is coming down from the north, and we have been notified of it. We sometimes are instructed to take what we call the ice track, or extreme southern route coming west.
A second question: you cannot say whether it is customary, according to your experience and observation, to lessen the speed of a ship under those conditions, approaching icebergs?
At other times, when I have approached ice with conditions approximately the same as they were in this case, as near as I can tell, we have gone at the ordinary rate of speed at which we had been going during the voyage.
And a final question: if the vessel had been running at a lower rate of speed, would not the chances of avoiding that iceberg have been increased?
When a vessel is running at a low rate of speed, she is slower on the helm, so the conditions would be totally different.
You can literally feel Lightoller refusing to play into what the senators are getting at. That second answer was like a politician avoiding answering a question they don't want to answer. Of course, a slower ship is going to have more time to react to an iceberg, but he is technically not wrong. But I don't know. I think these answers are a bit of a stretch on Lightoller's part. So Charles will now take us to 9 p.m. or thereabouts. Around this time, Captain Smith arrives on the bridge. Now, you may be wondering, shouldn't he always be on the bridge? The truth is, he can't always be there, and don't forget, his role as a White Star Line representative, dining and mingling with first-class passengers, is very important to the overall experience. So, around 9 p.m., Smith visits the bridge, and Lightoller describes their conversation.
We spoke about the weather, calmness of the sea, the clearness, about the time we should be getting up toward the vicinity of the ice, and how we should recognize it if we should see it, freshening up our minds as to the indications that ice gives of its proximity. We just conferred together, generally, for 25 minutes. Captain Smith made a remark that if it was in a slight degree hazy, there would be no doubt we should have to go very slowly.
This short conversation on the bridge ends with Smith departing, saying, "If in the slightest degree doubtful, let me know." Following this conversation, Lightoller tells 6th Officer Moody to ring up the crow's nest and tell them to
keep a sharp lookout for ice, particularly small ice and growlers.
A little Titanic 101 for everyone. Growlers are small icebergs. They're not big enough to be considered like a full-sized iceberg, but they're still pretty serious and likely indicative of larger icebergs to come. Speaking of the lookouts, actually, Lightoller is quite opinionated about them, as is clear in the following bit of testimony. He is asked, "The principal reliance is placed upon the man in the crow's nest or the men in the crow's nest?"
We place no reliance on them.
"What are they there for?"
They are there to keep a lookout, to assist you.
"Then why is no reliance placed upon them?"
Because speaking personally, I never rely on a lookout. I keep a lookout myself, and so does every other officer.
He clarifies this statement later because that does sound like he's saying that they're completely useless, that he does not use the lookouts in any way, but that is not what he means. What he means is,
The officer does not rely on the lookout to the extent of sitting down and having a smoke or anything like that. He keeps his own lookout.
He goes further to say,
The White Star Line Company, I may say incidentally, is the only company in the world, so far as I know, that carries 6 lookout men. We carry men who do nothing else night and day from the commencement to the finish of the voyage, except keep a lookout. They are 2 hours on and 4 hours off.
2 hours on and 4 hours off. That's a little better than your standard deck crew. But, standing in a crow's nest in the cold sounds atrocious, so they have a slightly easier schedule, I suppose. Lastly, the senators have a list of precautions that they're surprised to find that the officers and crew of Titanic and the White Star Line did not take. So they run them by Lightoller to see what he thinks of them. For example, it is a popular story in the Titanic universe that the lookouts were not given binoculars, that they had been misplaced. Oh, the humanity, what are the odds? Well, we will absolutely dive into this iconic talking point when we speak more with one of Titanic's 6 lookouts, all of whom survived, interestingly enough. But for now, let's just see what Charles thinks of binoculars, or as they call them back then, glasses.
Each man uses them as he wishes. Different men have different ideas of the glasses and of using them. Some keep them glued to their eyes altogether. I consider that very detrimental.
And how about Lightoller's opinion of the use of searchlights?
It would be an advantage to carry a searchlight if it is going to be of any benefit at all. If it can be proved beneficial, it would be an advantage.
What a classic White Star Line officer, non-committal politician's response. He says so little in that line. It would be an advantage if it can be a benefit. If it can be proved beneficial, it would be an advantage. It's just very funny how he's dancing around admitting that, yes, we could have done that and it would have been helpful. Though in Lightoller's defense, he does say elsewhere in his testimony that if you have a searchlight, which also, by the way, the reason boats don't have searchlights even today, it's not you don't put headlights on the front of a ship. Can you imagine how powerful the light would have to be to actually make any difference? Car headlights only go a few feet ahead of the car, and a ship would need extremely intense lights. But anyway, he does point out that if you shine a searchlight on an iceberg, it turns white. But so does the water. Anything you shine it at, it turns white. So it's not as helpful as it sounds. At least that's Lightoller's opinion. Lastly, the senators have to ask Lightoller of one more brilliant way to avoid an iceberg collision. He is asked, did you ever know in your experience as a seaman, or have you ever known, the steam whistle to be used to detect the presence of ice by means of an echo?
Certainly not.
Nothing of that kind was attempted on the Titanic?
Certainly not.
Love that. He's just getting so impatient with these American government men. So Lightoller's watch comes to a close at 10 p.m., and he is relieved by First Officer Murdoch. Lightoller is asked, what did they discuss?
We remarked on the weather, about its being calm, clear. We remarked the distance we could see. We seemed to be able to see a long distance. Everything was very clear. We could see the stars setting down on the horizon.
He is also asked, how cold was it?
31, sir.
Above zero?
31 degrees above zero, yes, sir.
Is that unusually cold for that longitude?
No, sir.
At that time of year?
No, sir.
It just feels like the senators are trying so hard to get Lightoller to admit that this was an abnormal setting. The weather was odd. The ice warnings, it was colder than normal. Like they were trying to make it seem like an abnormal evening to prove that the officers on board Titanic should have done something about it. Lightoller, meanwhile, is definitely painting the picture that all was very normal on the night of April 14th. The weather was clear and calm. The operations on board were as they always were. All precautions that had proven beneficial, were in place. The iceberg telegrams were just information. And so April 14th was a night like any other. But 1 hour and 40 minutes later, as Lightoller attempts to drift asleep, 3 bells are rung from the crow's nest, and Lightoller's night gets far more complicated. This brings me to one of my favorite questions. It's probably the question I look forward to the most when I'm going through someone's testimony, and that sort of feeling inspired this podcast. So I just love this question, and that is, what was the iceberg impact like? I love it because it's a question that yields a wide array of answers depending on who you ask. And I mean very wide, because think about it. Everyone on board is in a different location on the ship at different distances from the collision, so everyone hears it and feels it uniquely. But also, some people are half asleep. Others are wide awake. Some people startle easily. Other people aren't observant at all and miss it completely. But my favorite variable in all of this, these survivors who are asked in the inquiry to describe the collision, they're being asked to describe something that doesn't have an easy onomatopoeia assigned to it. You know, a gun goes bang. A horse clip-clops. A car goes vroom. We've all agreed on these sounds being how you describe these things. An iceberg grazing the side of a steel-plated ship underwater is hard to describe in one sentence. So you get these wild descriptions, such as Ella White, a passenger. She described it as, "It was just as though we went over about 1,000 marbles." These people have to get creative, and that's why I love it, because everyone gets creative in their own unique way. Lightoller, of course, keeps it very short and sweet, saying he witnessed
a slight jar and a grinding sound.
He is asked further about the collision. Where were you when the impact occurred?
In my berth.
Asleep?
No, sir. I was just getting off to sleep.
You arose?
Yes, sir.
You went out of your room?
Yes, sir.
Forward?
Out on deck.
He continues later, saying,
Excluding the bridge, I saw no one except the 3rd officer, who left his berth shortly after I did.
Did you confer about what had happened?
Yes, sir.
What did you conclude had happened?
Nothing much.
What did you assume it to be?
Ice.
Why?
That was the conclusion one naturally jumps to around the banks there.
Had you seen ice before?
No, sir.
For those keeping track, that is 2 out of 2 Titanic survivors on this podcast who had never seen an iceberg before. I find that fascinating. He is then asked, "Where did you go?"
Back to my berth.
What for?
There was no call for me to be on deck.
Did you believe that the boat was in danger?
No, sir.
And folks, we will stop there for this week. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode. If you enjoyed this in any way, please take a moment to like or subscribe or follow or even review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or rate it on Spotify, wherever you're listening. If you could do something to show your approval, that would help grow the podcast a little bit. But most importantly, please join Charles and I in episode 6 of Witness Titanic. We will cover the loading and launching of lifeboats, and we will hear what it was like to fight for your life in the freezing Atlantic Ocean. We will adjourn till then.